Nkambule. On behalf of the Presidential Climate Commission, it is an absolute pleasure to host this session. Good afternoon and welcome to all those who've joined us virtually. In particular, our representative from national and provincial government. Good afternoon also to my fellow commissioners and the Secretariat. Thank you for making the time to be with us this afternoon. We are looking forward to your participation, your input, your views on how you as government will be affected by this transaction. In particular, how the implementation of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan will ensure electricity security and access while decarbonizing the system and creating jobs in low carbon industries. At the heart of the just transition is the recognition of the impact that the electricity transition will have on livelihoods, workers, and communities. Today is primarily an information sharing system. We will host another session where you'll be able to share your input and recommendations with us. Following the successful launch of the JET IP at COP27, the President requested the PCC, Presidential Climate Commission, to conduct another round of consultations with public and sector and all sectors on the JET IP. A consultation has already been held with the local government, as most of the affected communities are within their jurisdiction. And also the transition will affect their current revenue stream. The collective recommendation which will arise from all these consultations, including this one, will be submitted to the President and government. The target date for that submission, I think it's around the end of this quarter. I'm not sure if we'll be able to make the date, but nevertheless, we'll have to submit as soon as we are done with the final consultation, which will be the national consultation. The 2019 IRP set our electricity mix and pathways. As a commission, we are developing a view of the electricity mix, generation and system mix, and governance of power in South Africa. This is in support of the DMRE update process, and is also in support of the recommendation report, which will come out of all these consultations. In late March, we'll have a national consultation, obviously, which will be hosted by the PCC on the consolidated electricity recommendation. That session will be held in Rosebank, if I'm not mistaken, where we need all the stakeholders to participate. And then out of that consultation, we'll now compile the final draft of recommendation that will be submitted to the President. As you are aware, as the Presidential Climate Commission, our suggestions, our recommendations are based on scientifically based research, locally and internationally. I would like to hand over to Steve Nichols, who will make a presentation on the modeling that we subscribe to as the Presidential Climate Commission. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just going to share my screen quickly. Hope everyone can see that and can hear me okay. As the Commission introduced, the PCC are running a series of stakeholder engagements backed by some research on the main economic modeling and energy modeling processes underway in South Africa, as well as some other areas related to regulations. And we are collating all of those into a set of recommendations that the PCC commissioners will make to the president. And so this is very much an awareness raising and consultative process. This is what we've learned so far. And we've had a number of engagements with other stakeholder groups as well. And so we really welcome your comments and your insights into what we put before you today. So the first main thing that's come across all of our engagements is that if we're comparing energy systems, we have to compare those systems at a high level, focus particularly on the least cost for the system to run as a whole, and not just for each individual component of the system. And then each system then also has to be comparable across these three areas. And so this is a thing called the energy trilemma, which is an output of the World Energy Council, and really basically saying for an electricity system to be effective, it has to be environmentally sustainable, and so it has to minimize its impact on air quality, climate change, and water. It has to enable energy equity, so people need to have access to that electricity. It needs to be affordable, and there needs to be a fair distribution of benefits and costs. And finally, that energy system must be secure, must be reliable and stable. And so, we in South Africa have an additional category around the social issues that are encompassed in the just transition. So we see this energy trilemma sitting within a just transition framework, the just transition framework having recently been released by the PCC and signed off by Cabinet. And so that's kind of the context. When we think about electricity systems, we have to be thinking about all of these components. Unfortunately, there's a lot of work that we can draw on. So there are a number of international studies that have looked at South Africa specifically, but also just general energy transitions internationally. And then there are a number of South African studies built mainly on three studies: the work by the NBI, the work by the University of Cape Town, sometimes in collaboration with others, their most recent collaboration with the World Bank on the Country Climate Development Report, and then the work that's done by the CSR, which has been most spread and analyzed by Meridian Economics. So some good studies, all of them are thinking about this trilemma. And they all more or less conclude the same things. Even if you unconstrain them, so there's no climate constraint, the least cost development option across all of these models is to build renewables, battery storage, and peaking gas. And so the models accept that you manage these systems differently, and you have to cope with different energy services that are provided by traditional systems in a different way. And in particular, you have to manage inertia and frequency and peaking. And so that's where gas comes in. So when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing and you can't quite meet demand, then you switch on a fast response, slightly more expensive per kilowatt hour equipment, and that then plugs the gaps. And that's generally how these new energy systems are designed, and we see these energy systems being implemented in countries around the world. But at a high level, what the models conclude is we need a massive and urgent investment in renewables. We need an urgent investment in the grid, and that is true around the world, but particularly true here in South Africa, where our grid is a real primary constraint in how we develop our electricity sector. Although the models have the option to choose coal or nuclear, they don't because of price and implementation time considerations. As I say, limited role for peaking for gas is fairly common across all of the models. All of the models invest heavily in storage, particularly battery storage, but pumped hydro is probably a first choice in terms of storage capacity. And there's a lot of investigation going on in South Africa where pumped storage sites are possible. I mentioned the need to manage inertia and frequency. And then the other sort of not well discussed thing that comes across all of the models is energy efficiency. So all of the models assume a certain energy efficiency target, and in particular, some of them are aligned with the National Energy Efficiency Strategy goals, which are quite high, so 30 to 40% energy efficiency across various sectors and households. So that's what a least cost system looks like across all of the models. Where cost is changes depends on how you constrain the model if you think about climate change. So an unconstrained model builds these things, but as you constrain them, in other words, if you put a tighter carbon budget on the model, then what it does is it closes coal earlier and builds those renewables and battery storage and grid investments earlier. And of course, that pushes up the cost as you're investing more upfront, and you haven't yet had the time to take advantage of cost advantage gains, particularly in renewables. So that's kind of how the model framework looks. Of course, when you're using models and thinking about forecasting, there are things that can change over time and a high degree of uncertainty, particularly as you go further out towards 2050. And so there are some things that we need to watch that might be game changers. In particular, the things that come up most are small modular reactors, so the role of nuclear in the system. It's a carbon neutral technology, and it provides a range of system services to the grid. And then carbon capture and storage. Neither of these technologies are mature yet. So globally, there aren't any commercially viable plants. And so we're watching this with careful attention, that they may change. The role of carbon capture and storage is also unlikely to play a huge role in the electricity sector, quite probably in the power sector, in the energy sector as a whole, particularly in high emission sources like petrochemicals. But in power and electricity, the CCS, if added to existing power plants, would make those power plants more expensive and less efficient because they have to use electricity to liquefy the carbon, and therefore they would be less competitive against renewables, and already they're not the least cost option. So we don't anticipate CCS playing a role in electricity, but these are technologies amongst others that need to be watched. So if we think about electricity systems and the two dominant systems we talk about in South Africa against that energy trilemma, the variable renewable energy systems are clearly better for climate change, water, air quality, and health. They also tend to be better for energy equity. On the affordability side, they're the least cost development option. But on the access side, you can also use distributed grids, microgrids, distributed rooftop solar, that allow access to locations without having to necessarily install large transmission and distribution infrastructure. So we tend to think that they're better than the traditional systems in terms of access, although of course, traditional systems can provide access. The fair distribution of benefits and costs are really about the just transition. This is how we do it. And so how we implement these systems is equally as important as which systems we implement. As many of you know, the big debate in South African society at the moment and in the press is around the energy security of the two systems. And our research shows that the variable renewable energy systems are as secure, and you just have to implement them in different ways. So both systems are secure in terms of reliability and stability. So that's kind of the long-term picture of what an energy system, least cost energy system would look like. But of course, we're in the short term facing this huge energy crisis, and that raises questions about would you implement different solutions to solve the more short-term problems? And in reality, you don't. And so because the least cost options are renewables, and because you can build renewables far quicker than you can sort of big energy infrastructure like coal, renewable is also far more responsive. And so the studies show that in the short term, you'd also build and focus on renewable-based systems, renewable storage, and gas for peaking. The big constraint in the short term, though, is grid availability. And so that is an area that's come up in most of our discussions with experts and communities. And so thinking about the spatial constraint that puts on you is important. And so, for example, although the best conditions for solar and wind might be in the Western and Northern Cape, there's no extraction capability. You can't get that energy to users at this stage. So the immediate the longer term challenge then is we need to invest in the grid now so that those sites become accessible and so that we keep supply into the system over the long term. In the short term, what we would want to do is focus on where there's grid capability available, which tends to be in Mpumalanga, Gauteng, and KZN. And so adjusting our approach to energy planning to one that acknowledges these spatial constraints is something that we think is a strong recommendation. And then you're also able to, so what you would do then, for example, in Mpumalanga, where you have grid access, is you would invest in your renewable generation infrastructure so that you maximize that grid access. And you can enhance that grid access by co-locating the generation with batteries, and that then spreads out the supply. So if the grid is constrained and you're able to produce energy, you put that energy into the battery for later use when the grid is not as constrained and perhaps the wind and the sun is not as strong. So this will require some governance reform, and in particular, something that's come up a lot is being much more transparent around the queuing system for grid connections. We think this kind of spatial approach has a couple of advantages. One is it kind of spreads out the jobs to places that are losing generation infrastructure, particularly in Mpumalanga, but also it creates ability for us to have very transparent, very detailed plans, and so that we can restore hope in the public and our communities that this problem is being worked on and being resolved, and we can say, and we also have a strong sense of the other supporting infrastructure and investment that is needed to make it happen. So we know if we're building X amount of megawatts in Mpumalanga, we also then need to know, well, we need X amount of steel. We also need to know what road condition we need, as well as where the materials might come from, and potentially also port upgrades. So this kind of spatial planning approach, we think, is a very useful way forward. But of course, there are a lot of things that we have to consider in electricity planning, the just transition being at the heart of those things. And there are short and long-term just transition elements that we need to consider very carefully. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but they're all important. The challenge that the commissioners face is to focus on 3 to 5 specific recommendations that they think are systemic and that will unlock the biggest change. And the same is true for the plethora of engineering issues that we can do, which are more or less clustered around these clusters: improving energy availability factor, working on a just transition, setting up an independent market and transmission operator, working with the public and private sector on energy efficiency, and getting as much new generation on the grid as possible, and a lot of detail in each of those. So the Commission has been looking at these 9 recommendations as our priority investment areas, and I'll run through them quickly, and this really is the basis for any questions you might have or the conversation that we hope to have with you. So the first one that I've mentioned already, developing a short-term spatial plan that maximizes grid usage. This can be done in a very public participatory way, and also then helps people have very realistic assumptions around the timing of ending load shedding. Large-scale governance reform, a critical part of this reform process is establishing an independent grid operator that enables more market-based measures, like setting up a day-ahead market, making queuing systems for grid access more transparent, I've mentioned. And then a big part of this overall reform is thinking about pricing and adjusting the pricing system to be both cost reflective and unbundled. And so there are 2 ways that we can pay for electricity. One is through the tariff, and another is through tax, through the tax system. And the advantage of you doing it through the tariff is you put the cost of electricity consumption on the user, and therefore there's an incentive to be more energy efficient. The other challenge that we have as the grid becomes a much more important part of the system, both at a transmission and a distribution level, is how we fund that grid. And so the costs of electricity will have to more accurately reflect what is needed to maintain the transmission and grid and distribution infrastructure. And of course, the role of local governments in that is also particularly important. A huge drive on energy efficiency, storage, batteries, and demand-side management is obviously key. And then on the sort of technical side, the final thing is investing in grid upgrades in the long term to enable access to more renewable energy around the country, but also in the short term to enhance the available grid so that we can move quickly to solve load shedding. Then there are 3 recommendations around the just transition that I think are important. Supporting public, private, and household renewable energy generation and storage is key, and that then requires a lot of working with cities who will be the implementers of many of those programs, and that might require also some policy reform and pricing reform, and significantly capacity enhancement of municipalities. And when Joanne talks a little bit later about the Just Energy Transaction Investment Plan, that is a big part of how they're thinking. Second to last one, ensuring that those most impacted by load shedding are protected. And we think there of poor households and SMMEs in particular, SMMEs that use energy as part of their business, hairdressers, food resellers, spas or shops, welders, maintenance specialists, all require electricity for their business to function. And of course, poor households need electricity to have basic services and to access economic opportunity. And so part of that is incentives for SMMEs. Part of that is thinking about the free basic electricity system. What is a reasonable amount of free basic electricity, and how do we enhance the disbursement of those grants? Not all households are able to access free basic electricity, and that's something that requires reform. And then the last point, which is particularly important, is thinking about economic diversification. So even if we manage to create jobs for every person that currently works in the coal sector, that might, as you phase the coal sector out over time, even if we create exactly the same amount of jobs, you would still have 40% unemployment in Mpumalanga. And that is a problem that requires greater focus. And so building other economic opportunities in those areas that take advantage of green electricity, that create export opportunities, that create localization opportunities, that create opportunities in sectors that might not be related to electricity or energy at all, is all part of the just transition debate. So these are the recommendations that are in draft, and we are very happy for you to comment and ask questions. And if we've missed something, we would love to hear from you. If you think we've overemphasized something, we'd love to hear from you. So so I will end there, Commissioner, and hand back to you for questions.
Thanks so much, Steve, and thanks for keeping it within time, so we have time for a good debate. If I could ask if there's one comment in the chat, but I'm not sure if there's any hands at this point in time to question, to kick off the discussion on our energy process.
So, sorry, Commissioner, could you please repeat that?
Sorry, I'm just trying to, there's my camera.
Yeah.
Thanks. I was just wanting to see if there were any hands, and I see Brian has raised his hand. Brian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and greetings to Steve and everyone on the call. It's me who put a question in the chat because I can't get access to the Q&A, and I was engaging with, and I was saying to assist with that. So Steve, if you can just read the question while I just briefly refer to it. Just looking at your graphs, we obviously need significant amounts of gas to balance the variable renewables in the longer term. But in the short term, do we not also need all the electrons that we can get? And my question is about the limitations on the build of renewables, because you're talking about something like 50 gigawatts by 2030. My numbers, not yours. I don't think your numbers are very different. and we've only built 1 or 2 gigawatts a year. So we've got to ramp up significantly, and that doesn't happen in a year or 2 or 3. That happens if we had to build. If we had to plan for next year, we're probably talking something like 3 gigawatts, then 5, then 7. But how quickly do we get to an average of 7 a year, or cumulative 7 gigawatts per year by 2030? My question then is it not preferable to also build gas to power? Because in any case, you need it in the long term. I understand it's low utilization, but high capacity, and that's all about the variable renewables. But in the short term, you might utilize some of it very well at a higher utilization because you can't build enough renewables quickly enough. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Brian. We also have a hand from Lyndon. Lyndon.
Thank you, Commissioner. My question to Steve is, how does the plan take into account those areas, or geographical areas, that are in a state of energy poverty? And I am thinking in particular about the Eastern Cape and the former Ciskei and Transkei, where there is significant opportunities, but there's no infrastructure to support those opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lyndon. And then, Steve, there's another comment in the chat regarding the potential for repurposing the current coal plants, noting that the road to net zero encompasses a variety of areas. So I think I don't see any other hands. Could I hand back to you to provide input on those 3 questions? Thanks.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, Brian's question is an excellent one and also a very technical one. But at a very high level, the question is that if we can't build renewables at the rate we need to, and roughly we need to build between 6 and 7 gigawatts of renewables every year between now and 2050 in order to match supply and demand. That is a big ask, particularly in the short term, and there are constraints to how quickly we can build, skills-wise, capital-wise, but also simple things like, do we have enough cranes to erect the wind towers, for example? And so that does impose a constraint on the system. And then the sort of solution Brian is posing is, can we build that gas infrastructure a little bit quicker and use that gas infrastructure to make up some of the shortfall? And I guess the short answer is yes. And the big thing we need to think about when we talk about gas infrastructure is the difference between installed capacity and utilization. And so most of the plans and the models that we looked at installed somewhere between 3 and 10 gigawatts of renewables, and they ran those at very low utilizations, 5 to 15%, depending on the pace of renewable energy rollout. It does also, though, provide an insurance function that if we don't meet those energy rollout targets, then you have the sort of utilization left in the system to meet the gap in demand. The challenge, I guess, is the price. So generating a kilowatt hour from gas is somewhere around 3 Rand, whereas generating a kilowatt hour from renewables is sort of somewhere around 70 to 80 cents. And so you pay a premium for the access to that electricity, but it does give you a sort of security function. So you would need to combine that kind of thinking with pricing reform so that you can kind of manage price impacts, particularly on the poor. The last point I would make is you would have to make sure that the technologies you choose are able to run at low utilizations, and that you don't bet on a technology that requires high utilizations. There is also a small advantage to running those gas plants at high utilizations early on to try to resolve load shedding, in that the commercialization of the investment in those plants is easier. So that's, I mean, I think there's probably nothing new for you there, Brian.
No, there were 1 or 2, Steve, and I'll contact you next week offline, but great insight. Thank you.
Okay, cool. And then Lyndon, yeah, so I think your point about energy access is really important. And in fact, it's one of the things that we are going to organize when this sort of spurt of stakeholder engagement sessions that we're hosting is over, is an event specifically looking at access as a core just transition outcome. And we do think that variable renewable energy systems have some big advantages in terms of access. So you can get to rural communities and difficult to reach mountainous areas in the Eastern Cape, for example, with distributed grids and microgrids. And so I mean, I agree with your comments entirely that there's a significant opportunity for infrastructure there. While you build out a longer term, more reliable energy infrastructure. And then that links quite well with the last point around the potential of repurposing current coal plants. Eskom have some quite sophisticated plans on how to repurpose each of those plants that are a combination of kind of manufacturing facilities, renewable energy, and use of the land. And one of the things that they are manufacturing are containers, shipping container sized mini grids. And you when you buy the container, you get everything that you need to sort of establish a mini grid in an area. So there's quite a strong connection between creating some enterprise there and being able to solve some of those energy access problems. So I think that was the three that I had to cover.
It is, thank you. We have both a hand and a comment from Sarah. So Sarah, over to you. I don't know if you want to add more on your question regarding supporting municipalities. Thanks. Sarah, you're on mute.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can, thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi, this is Sarah Lawson from USAID Southern Africa, and we're doing some thinking about how it can be useful in the energy space. Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to hear if maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what you said about municipalities. This seems like a very interesting level. Could you talk more about where you see the greatest need in municipalities, how to approach and work with them to reach energy sector goals, and what sorts of aspects in the policy, regulatory, and sort of other framework, including things like distributed PV, might be interesting? Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thanks, Sarah. Steve, you can go ahead. I don't see any other hands at this stage.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, it's a very detailed question. So some of the things that we're looking at and that we're hearing from stakeholders is quite administrative. So it's some of the municipalities are challenged in maintaining things like indigent registers, so they don't really know who needs to get free basic electricity. But also, even if they do have an up-to-date register, having the systems to know how much energy they're using and what that's costing the city, that they're not able to ascertain that, and therefore not able to distribute it effectively. And then there are challenges even at big metros. So for example, in some of the sort of major cities in South Africa, they may want to implement systems allowing rooftop solar and feed-in tariffs, but they don't have the administrative systems to track what that will, how much they have to repay to users and to reconcile that with a usage bill. So there's a whole bunch of sort of infrastructure capacity issues that have to be resolved there as well. And then, of course, there are the issues on pricing. And so the sort of common sort of mantra is that cities use their electricity sales to subsidize other social benefits across the city, like social housing or healthcare. But as we've investigated, we get quite mixed messages on that. Some of the municipalities, particularly the poorer municipalities, are saying, well, the energy systems are actually a loss for them. They put more money in than they get out, and particularly where they're not able to sort of really accurately track billing. So there are a number of things there that need to be resolved as well. And then, of course, there's municipal level energy efficiency, and the DMRE have some really good programs on that to help drive energy efficiency within municipal buildings. But that also requires a fairly high amount of technical assistance. So those are some of the areas. And I think Joanne will also talk more about the role of municipalities in implementing the just transition elements of the broader rollout plan. That also requires, the municipalities are really the interface and engagement with implementation. And so they need, significant support. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Steve. And I don't see any other hands, but my area of interest around demand side, so managing energy efficiency, and you had that as one of the key priorities. How do we drive energy efficiency as opposed to the current obsession with generation?
I mean, that's the golden question. As we go through this consultative process, I think we're going to have at the end of the day a mix of things where we've got fairly solid ideas on ways forward, and then some things that are not. And I think the energy efficiency one is one that needs a lot more discussion. So everybody can say to us, yes, energy efficiency is really important. It's built into the models. It's built into national policy, but implementation really lags. And there's some interesting experience on that. The NBI ran a program in 2015 to 2019 called the Private Sector Energy Efficiency Program. I think I've got those dates right. And there they unlocked or discovered a huge amount of investment opportunity, 2.1 billion rand, if I remember correctly, that had pretty quick payback periods, an average payback period of about 2 years. But getting small businesses to invest in energy efficiency is hugely challenging, partly from an expertise perspective. So if someone is running a business, they're the CFO and the chief energy officer and the head of marketing, and so they, first of all, don't really have the time to pay attention to what would be a good energy efficiency project. And if they have the capital to invest, they tend to favor things they know. So putting in a new production line or spending on acquiring new customers. Mm-hmm. And so there's a big capacity building part of that. And so, the work that the NBI did showed that you need to have some quite concessional debt in the markets in order to attract investments to energy efficiency, like 2 to 3% better than what you could otherwise get. And so there are a couple of banks and institutions like yourselves looking at this problem. So be interested to hear if you've got any sort of high-level thoughts as well. And then the other side of the coin is the public sector energy efficiency, which I mentioned earlier. And there, the DMRE and the IDC are working on some quite ambitious programs to encourage energy efficiency in municipalities.
Thanks. So I do think that the gigawatt numbers mentioned were quite significant where it comes to savings. So I do think that there's, as you say, more energy and effort that needs to go into solving that. I don't see any other hands. I think that we've had a lot of people joining today to get into the meaty part of what comes next. So I'm going to just give one last offer to the room to clarify any questions around the energy process. No. Great. Well, thank you.
A last comment from me. If people want to drop questions into the Q&A as they come up, I'll monitor the Q&A and answer there.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks very much. Because there might be some links drawn in the next section that might raise questions on the content delivered today. So thank you so much. So please do just post your questions should you have any. Thanks, Steve, for the presentation. And Joanne, can I hand over to you to kick off on the JET IP presentation? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I note Georgina's question, which I think maybe she's just put in the chat, which I think Steve must maybe come back to at the end. Okay, so following on from the overall work that the PCC has been doing around the energy system, this presentation goes into a much more kind of narrow and focused set of issues, which is essentially to very quickly run through the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, which has got a 2023 to 2027 timeframe, and which comes out of the high-level agreement that South Africa made with the International Partners Group, which really consists of the US, the UK, the EU, France, and Germany, and the high-level political declaration was agreed to at COP26 in Glasgow. So kind of just to locate it. Can we go on to the next slide? Okay. So in drafting a just energy transition investment plan, and maybe just to say that in that political declaration, what South Africa agreed to do in return for financing from the international community was to really increase its level of ambition in relation to the reduction of emissions. And I'll come back into that and the framing of that in a little bit more detail later. But in striking an agreement around that, what we did was to really take into account as a country, I suppose, the overall climate context. And firstly, and I'm not going to go, the slides will have been and will be distributed to anybody who wants them. I see that there are a number of people on the call today who've been at a number of the other sessions, so who will be hearing this over and over again. But if anybody wants them, we will make sure that you've got all of the documents. So the framing: South Africa faces serious climate risks, and those risks are partly physical, so issues, drought, floods, fires, things like that, but also the fact that we are the 12th highest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, and that the goods that we produce and the goods that we export have a very high degree of carbon embedded in them. And that poses enormous risks to our trade and to our balance of payments and into the future, as many of our trading partners take measures to prevent carbon-intensive goods from competing with their own goods. And then, most importantly, in many ways, and linked to this is the risks that if we don't manage this low carbon transition in an orderly way, it's going to have some dire effects on workers, communities, and industries. And so we're in a kind of, I suppose, an inexorable process of change, and that process of change needs to be well managed in the context of moving from a high carbon economy to a net zero one. And what we want to do is to really manage this transition well and use it to also address poverty, inequality, unemployment, and economic exclusion. So in other words, look for the opportunities in this process. It is something that will involve all sectors of society, whether or not people want to be involved. Climate change impacts us all. And then the work that the PCC does has allowed a process where the social partners can try and build consensus. So going into the international environment, we're a signatory to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. And in terms of both the convention and that agreement, there is an obligation on the developed world to support the developing world in relation to achieving its climate commitments. And so that kind of frames the context of this. Maybe also to say this doesn't only apply to South Africa, and since the work on this plan began, there are a number of other countries across the world, including on our own continent, Nigeria, Senegal, and Egypt, as well as Vietnam and Indonesia, who were inspired to start working on similar plans with the intention of similar partnerships with the international community and specifically with the International Partners Group. So this investment plan sets out the scale of need, and I'll come back to that, and financing options for a 5-year period that will basically put us on a track to decarbonize the economy at the scale that would enable us to meet the targets that we've set in our nationally determined contribution. And the 5-year period is because the political declaration talks about a 5-year rolling program that will be agreed between South Africa and the international partners. And the approach that we took was to say, let's look at that first 5-year period and look at what we need to do in that 5-year period to put us on the track to achieve those emission reductions. Next slide. And I'm going to speed up considerably towards the end. So this sets out really what this plan contains. And on the left-hand side, we show the NDC range. So as a country, we have committed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from within a range of, at the top, 420 megatons of carbon equivalent at the top of the range to 350 megatons of carbon equivalent at the bottom by 2030. And just to say that what I think there is an acceptance, and if you look at the detail of the investment plan, and particularly the modeling that informed it, you will see that reaching 420 megatons carbon equivalent is probably something that within the context of our IRP and our energy plans that we could achieve as a country on our own without any support. But if you want to move further down that range and move towards 350 megatons carbon equivalent, then the need for support in the form of finance, technology, and capacity from the international community is a critical prerequisite. And that structures this investment plan. So in the work that we did, what we estimated is that South Africa's ask, and this is an ask from a wide range of sources, is are in the region of around 1.5 trillion rand over the 5-year period to support investments in 3 key sectors: electricity, new energy and electric vehicles, and green hydrogen. And then in the process of doing the plan, I think that what became very clear to us is that unless we address the issues of human capital development and the issues of what the role is that municipalities would play and what they needed to do, we would have to, we couldn't have a viable plan. So the cross-cutting areas, and I'll come onto them later, are around skills development in municipalities. Next slide. Okay, and this slide just sets out, I think, I spoke about the opportunity space that we would like to see realized through the just energy transition. And this slide sets that out. So we would want to see vulnerable workers and communities being protected, energy security being built. So in other words, use the long-term decarbonization programs to also address our energy crisis at the moment. Expand energy access, in particular to people who do not have at the moment or can't afford to access electricity. We want to see a program promoting industrial development and driving innovation. We'd want to see sustainable livelihoods created in the context of economic diversification in key sectors, and we'd like to see a program that spurs inclusive economic growth. So a kind of, I think, a lofty set of ambitions, but critical for the country. Next slide. Okay, this slide is a summary of pretty much everything else, apart from a few slides at the end that is going to, that I'll go through. So what the work that we did set out was that if we were to achieve what we want to in the electricity sector, we're looking at mobilizing around 711 billion rand of finance for that sector. And I'll show you how it's broken down. For electric vehicles, 128 billion, for green hydrogen, 319. The skills development, the small skills development amount, let me explain, does not take into account the existing funds in the tertiary education sector or in the private sector that go into the CETAs and the TVET colleges and the universities. But nevertheless, it is a kind of, it does some very specific things in this context. And then we identified that municipalities, to support this transition, would need an amount of around 319 billion. Next slide. Okay. South Africa has a very comprehensive framework, climate change framework, as well as an energy policy framework. The energy policy framework is moving extremely rapidly at the moment, as all of you on this call will know. In the last year, there have been some very major reforms being undertaken that are continuing apace. The passage of, for example, the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill through Parliament later on this year will bring some very, very fundamental reforms to the way our electricity system is managed. We also have the Climate Change Bill that is currently, a set of consultations, and including one this afternoon, and portfolio committee hearings, and that bill is making its way through Parliament. So this sets out the enabling policy framework for the JET IP. As I said, this really, I suppose, reflects the state of the framework as it was in November last year. And we took that framework as set in the process of putting together the plan and going forward into an implementation phase. Obviously, we'd need to take account of the changes that have happened and the new measures that have been introduced since then, including, for example, the introduction in the budget of subsidies for panels for residential homes and finance for businesses investing in solar PV systems. Next slide. To go into the breakdown of the electricity sector, the difference between the 647 and the 711 that I spoke about comes in the next slide, and really is related to some of the just transition interventions, particularly in Mpumalanga. So we have put aside allocations. Steve spoke a lot about the needs in relation to transmission. The distribution referred to here is really Eskom distribution, because Eskom runs part of the distribution network itself. There are provisions for new solar and new wind that are in alignment with what is being rolled out at the moment, as well as a provision for some degree of battery storage. And then lastly, as coal plants reach their end of life according to what is set out in the IRP, there is a provision for coal plant decommissioning, and then a little bit later on for the repurposing and repowering of those plants that have reached end of life. Next slide. On the just transition, I think that what we recognized is that if we are looking at the coal value chain, there are very specific issues that need to be addressed in the context of primarily the Mpumalanga region. And Minister Mantashe always talks about the 10 towns in the coal belt. So we're talking about interventions that relate to the coal belt. And there are a set of activities around, firstly, repurposing of coal plants. Secondly, looking at repurposing coal mining land, and that is linked to rehabilitation and post-mining redevelopment, and being able to utilize that land for productive purposes once the mines close. We've looked at improving the general infrastructure in the Mpumalanga province. There is some quite serious infrastructure degradation, including to the road network. We've looked at allocations for diversification of local economies and for planning and capacity building. And then there are allocations for what we've called caring for the coal workforce. And this is really looking at social protection for people. And it's not only direct coal workers, but it's also people in the coal value chain who at a point a mine closes or a power station or a unit in a power station is decommissioned and repurposed, may not be able to find their way into a new economic activity easily. Maybe they are people who are just approaching retirement, or they are working in the informal sector and stand to have their livelihoods taken away. And we believe, and looking at international experience in other parts of the world, it's quite important to put aside allocations for social protection to support those people through the transition. There is then an allocation for particularly focusing on the issue of youth skills and youth employability, also in the context of the future of work. And the changing way that the changing set of skills that are required for young people to be workplace ready, including the need to be able to manage an increasingly digital and automated environment. Next slide. The last on this are really looking at the fact that there is an opportunity, and I think Steve spoke earlier on about the possibilities of building the new renewable installed capacity in areas where there's grid connection. And here there is obviously an opportunity to also look at localizing the clean and energy value chain. The South African Renewables Energy Master Plan that is has been worked on has got some very clear recommendations about what elements of that value chain may well be able to be successfully localized. And lastly, an issue I think that has come up right throughout the consultative process around this work, which is that we really need to develop in our country a much more diverse set of ownership models for this infrastructure, including looking at cooperatives, looking at workers being able to access ownership, looking at community ownership of renewables, looking at ways essentially that we can spread the benefit of this new installed capacity, and making sure that we don't end up in a situation where it is only the rich who benefit and the poor are left out of the equation. So some very systematic work to come up with some ideas about how this could be rolled out quite broadly. And I think particularly from labor and civil society, this has been something that there has been very clear requests that this becomes a central element of the plan, and where we're suggesting starting is with some level of pilot development. Next slide. Okay, people were asking questions around the municipalities, and what we've looked at is what is needed for the distribution network in order that it can support both, that it can improve the quality of the grid through maintenance, but also so that it can modernize the grid and be able to respond to the introduction of a much more distributed power system. Be able to achieve things like reverse metering. We were talking about energy efficiency earlier on. So for example, ripple control on geysers. There are a whole set of measures that would support our intentions in relation to both energy efficiency as well as a greater level of renewable in the system. And so we've made provisions for all of that, as well as for building the capacity that municipalities need and the capability that would enable this kind of a grid to be efficiently and effectively run. Just two things. The first is to say that that very big infrastructure amount at the top is an estimate. I mean, I think it's a fairly well put together estimate, but there is further work to be done there to understand whether that is an adequate amount, how it would need to be spread, and the specifics of that kind of finance. And then lastly, one of the issues that has come up in the consultations around this plan, and I think Steve also mentioned it, is the issue of basically the municipal financing model around electricity. It includes free basic electricity, and whether we have a system that is fit for purpose there and that is efficient or effective, but it also includes issues around the viability of the system, including the fact that historically for a very long time, many municipalities have utilized revenues from electricity to support and to cross-subsidize the provision of other services, and that is increasingly something that can no longer be met. So there's a set of bigger questions that will be looked at. Some of this work is being done in the context of the National Electricity Crisis Committee. So we'd have to look quite carefully at what are the elements of this work going forward in terms of implementation that are already being done by institutions such as the DMRE and NECOM, and where is there work that would need to be done through this program. Next slide. Okay, this is the work that was done on the NEVs, and I think it is important to say that, again, the policy framework has moved quite considerably since this work was done, including the fact that the DTIC thinking has progressed, as well as there is thinking that has now been put on the table from the automotive industry. But essentially, we're looking at a number of things. We're looking at, on the one hand, emission reductions. On the other hand, we're looking at what are we going to do around the fact that our automotive industry is a very major employer and a very major contributor to our foreign earnings. 60% of the vehicles that we produce in South Africa are exported, the vast majority of them to the EU. And the kind of phase out of ICE vehicles, the target dates in Europe and the US and other parts of our key markets are around 2035. So if we don't have a strategy to look at what are we going to do and how are we going to, what are we going to be producing, what kinds of vehicles, and how are we going to respond to those phase-out deadlines, we really do risk creating a situation in which we lose a key economic sector and in which we're going to lose a very, very large value chain of jobs as well. So significant work to be done. We would want to see a situation where the electric vehicle opportunity is one that is significantly used to support improvements in the public transport system. Again, it's similar to the issue of social ownership, which is that you could go for a model where all you're looking at is high-end passenger cars, but it's not going to make a change to issues of affordability, access, inequality. And so there's an opportunity there that we should be looking at. And then there really is the question of how do we support the industry in making this transition. And I think it's a very difficult issue also because there are competitor countries on the continent who are looking at investing in building their industries and explicitly are saying they think they could do it maybe a bit better than we can. Next slide. Okay, green hydrogen. And I'm sure that everyone on this call, and particularly all of the government people, are familiar with the hydrogen roadmap, the hydrogen commercialization strategy, and all of the work that has been done in government over quite a long period of time that has been headed up by departments such as the DSI and the DTIC. In doing this work, we're conscious of the fact that South Africa has a whole lot of important assets in relation to the rollout of a green hydrogen sector, including the fact that Sasol has the Fischer-Tropsch intellectual property, that we have sufficient land and sun to be able to build a green hydrogen economy, and that we have significant hydrogen management capacity in our system. So I think we have undeniable assets here. In order to make a hydrogen economy viable, and I think there are two important sides to this. The one is that we would need to have an export market for some of the product that would be produced. But the second is that if we want to keep our heavy industries intact in the country into the future, and particularly into a net zero world, then we would need to have a green and low carbon fuel source, and hydrogen is what is being seen as the solution across the world. So the work that has been done is really on the left-hand side around project feasibility for different projects that are currently in the early stages. Then we costed the capital costs for the projects. And then lastly, in the context of the export requirement that we would need, we've put in an amount for the potential development of new ports that would then allow for the export of hydrogen efficiently, and for us to maximize what we could get out of that industry. Next slide. Skills, I've spoken about the fact that this excludes kind of sort of what is in the system. It's just from this finance, and here we are looking at setting up a platform, a high-level coordination around the future of work in the context of the just energy transition, an allocation for pilot skills development zones in Mpumalanga, the Eastern Cape and the Northern Cape, and that really speaks to electricity, energy, and hydrogen. And then some capacity to be able to look at how we leverage what is currently in the private and the public sector in order, particularly in areas like Mpumalanga, like the Eastern Cape, like the Northern Cape, to be able to build effective skills system and be able to have the human capital capacity to run these new economies. Next slide. Okay, I want to come on to financing, and importantly to say these, there is a slide that sets out the principles that the country felt would be important in mobilizing this very big amount of finance that we are looking at. This work came out of the consultations in the presidential climate finance task team that was run by Daniel Manele, who's now chairing the Nedbank board. There were a larger number of both our of government departments involved in this, including National Treasury, as well as our own, the IDC and the DBSA. So I think that kind of an inclusive group, and this was consulted, I think, quite widely at the time that it was done. So I think that firstly, I've already spoken about the UNFCCC principles around the way support should happen. We would want this finance to be additional to existing climate and development commitments, and are currently, in fact, working with the IPG around that. It should reflect our country's unique needs as reflected in the investment plan. The financing of the just transition component should be mainstream, so they can't be a kind of small add-on. A core principle was that sovereign debt terms should be more attractive than could be secured in the capital markets. And I think that we've seen, in particular with the DPO loans that are currently in the system, that is the case. And maybe National Treasury could comment on that. We wanted predictable and certain finance flows. We wanted the finance to be channeled through institutions best placed to manage it. Given that there will be some private sector involvement in this program, we need to make sure that there is appropriate risk sharing between the private sector and government, so that there is a kind of balanced set of agreements and it isn't tilted unfairly to either side. And then lastly, that there's got to be robust governance and safeguards to ensure that that money is used for the purposes that it is intended, and that happens through fair process. Next slide. Okay, now core to this is this $8.5 billion package that was put on the table by the IPG in this slide. And I think probably many of the government people in this room are very familiar with this. But this slide sets out the nature of the finance as well as the contribution from the different IPG partners. Important to say, I think that we've been in a bit of a chicken and egg situation. There are quite a lot of other partners who are very keen to come in, potential partners, both from other countries as well as from the private sector and philanthropies, who, now that the plan is on the table, are keen to come in and support it. But this is the core of the program, the core initial financing. And then I'll just run through it very briefly. The grant amount, and this is something that everybody from the President down has been concerned about, is that the grants are a very small proportion of the total. And since South Africa's response to that has been made clear, in fact, a number of the partner countries, including notably Germany and the US, have put additional grant amounts on the table, and there are currently conversations around how that would be deployed. The biggest part of the package is around concessional loans, with the biggest amount being the Climate Investment Fund's Accelerating Coal Transition Program. And then there is, from both the UK and from the US, private sector finance that would flow into the private sector, including into, we would hope, SMEs and BBBE companies, in order that they can access the economic opportunities that we're talking about. There's a 1.3 billion guarantee from the United Kingdom that would be allocated to the African Development Bank, who would then look at how that finance could be leveraged. And in relation to, in particular, the sovereign loans part of this, National Treasury becomes the critical institution that is responsible for managing that. Next slide. Okay, the plan was handed over by the President to the International Partners Group at the COP in Egypt. Prior to that, the President launched it at a meeting of the PCC and asked the PCC to consult to take forward these consultations. And at the same time, there has been a process of starting to move into implementation, I think, on the understanding that the outcomes of this consultation will be critical in terms of whatever amendments or changes might be needed to the plan. What is important here is, firstly, ministerial oversight, governance, and political coordination. Secondly, that national government has a critical coordinating role, including to ensure that that national plans are updated, that ongoing finance is mobilized, and monitoring and reporting of the program as a whole takes place. There will obviously be institution-specific funding agreements between the providers of finance and the implementing institution. I've spoken about the National Treasury will manage the sovereign loan agreements with the providers of finance. We think there's an important role for our national intermediary institutions, such as the DBSA and IDC, to manage disbursements of capital from providers to a wide range of organizations. We would want to see a close set of relationships and engagements in relation to community level governance, community and labor, and also from the trade unions, in relation to identification of needs, looking at visibility of projects, looking at monitoring and learning, and also looking at the role that they can play in the implementation of the program. And then what we would want is that private sector parties benefiting from the finance that is available in this program, we would want to be reporting into the National Results Monitoring system. Next slide. And I think this is the last one. Yeah. So in essence, going forward in relation to implementation, we would want strong governance arrangements. We would want robust management, and strong coordination, I think, is part of that. A strong coordination across all the three spheres of government, as well as transversely across government. We would want a strong monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework, and we would want to a proactive risk management framework that would enable us to be able to identify risks in advance and put in place measures to manage them. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Thanks for that, and welcome, Daniel. I see Daniel is here to support you.
Fabulous.
Thanks. Can I open up to any comments or questions? I don't see anything in the chat, and thank you, Steve, for addressing the question from Georgina. Thabang, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Joanne, for the presentation. Maybe Joanne, just to confirm my understanding. So the plan is linked by and large to the work that has been done to identify what can be done, especially in the electricity sector. In other words, those projects that Steve, or those options that Steve presented. And the plan, the bulk of the plan is to enable those projects on the generation side. Is my understanding correct?
Thanks, Thabang. Joanne, you're on mute.
Sorry, I think actually, Thabang, the priority is really around, I think, the transmission. I mean, if we had to try and prioritize anything at this point in time, I think it would be investment in transmission. And I think that it then links to the IRP in terms of the kind of, well, the IRP and the electricity reforms that are happening more broadly in relation to the level of renewable capacity that is seen to be coming into the system, both through the REAP and through some of the embedded and self-generation programs that are being built. And as I said, this finance goes to both public and private sectors, given the allocations that are outlined around the $8.5 billion. And I think maybe also to say that there is a lot of devil in the detail and a lot of work that now needs to be done to say, how is this all going to happen? And given the broader context of the work that NECOM is doing, what would be the best way, in fact, to take this forward?
Thanks very, very much, Joanne. And Thabang, I think that does talk to the value in an update being shared with this audience at a future date on the IRP, because everything is interrelated, and the investment plan does focus on some of those early priorities, with the grid being the greatest constraint that we face currently. Thabang, is that a fresh hand?
It's a follow-up, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, just there's a slide, Joanne, on where you show the disaggregation on the allocation for the electricity sector. So when you break down the 8.5 billion, how that is disaggregated for electricity option. So just so that we are clear, so the wind and solar and new batteries is in the context of the current policy framework, right? So it's not the proposals that are still to be consulted upon with other government departments, including ourselves. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. As I said, Thabang, I mean, you know, this plan really reflects where we were at in November last year at the point that it was finalized. I think the intention is through these consultations is to get feedback, but I think going forward into implementation, obviously we then have to take into account the changes in the policy framework and decisions of government and look at how those then impact upon the plan. And that is work that will be taken forward in the next months. It's not anything that has yet happened.
Thanks very much, Joanne. Deepak, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanne and Joanne. Just to maybe be more specific with respect to the question that Tabang is asking, there is a difference between the energy mix work based on modeling as well as a set of carbon considerations that the PCC is doing, and which we intend through Steve's work, the mitigation portfolio's work in the PCC, to input into the DMRE's revision or amendment, whatever the case might be, of the IRP, and the work that the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team did. The Presidential Finance Task Team, in the first instance, was responding to the $8.5 billion offer. In the second instance, in terms of the political declaration, was then also tasked, assisted by the Secretariat of the JET-P, to come up with a more all-encompassing investment plan. And all along the conversation in the PCFTT, we were fully aware that the recommendations, while they were driven in some part by decarbonisation, as well as current electricity insecurity, needed to be consistent with existing government policy. And so the JET-IP is consistent with the IRP as it currently exists, with a focus on grid strengthening and a rapid rollout of renewables, still consistent with the IRP 19.
Thanks very much, Deepak, for that further clarification. Any hands, any questions? This is normally such a hotly contested and engaged topic. Samila? Thanks, Samila, we can't hear you. Samila, you appear to have come off mute, but we can't hear you. I don't know if you want to pop the question in the chat. One of the downsides of our current load shedding is connectivity to the internet. Any other comments or questions? I don't see any comments.
Her question is in the chat, Joanne.
Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. It hadn't shown up on my side. Joanne, what is the status of the $8.5 billion? Has South Africa accepted as is or with conditions? And if with conditions, what are those conditions?
Okay, so the $8.5 billion is an offer that, as you have seen, is broken up into different kinds of allocations for different purposes from the different country parties. And we're currently moving into implementation. And in that process, part of what needs to be done is to be able to understand the detail of it, which is currently an exercise that is happening with the IPG, as well as to negotiate. So it isn't the kind of offer where kind of take it or leave it offer. It is about how do we build the partnership around these financial offers, what works for us and what works for the partners, and how do you come to agreement. The most mature part of this at this point in time are the policy, the policy loans that have been offered by the French and the German development agencies to National Treasury, and that National Treasury has negotiated in relation to that, and would need to update with AFD and with KfW. So those are the most far advanced. And at the moment, we're also trying to work with the IPG to understand what is in the grant element, the grant offers, what is being considered. So all of that work is work that is in its early stages now and will go forward. And I think it's going to be quite important as that process runs, that there are ongoing updates to stakeholders so that people are clear about what the status is, but early days at the moment.
Thanks very much, Joanne. And I think, as you mentioned, there are a number of countries as well as a number of parties within those countries that are looking to provide the support. Any other comments or clarifications from any of the participants? Catherine?
And I literally have to drop off because I got something else, but I need to re-ask this question because I think it was incorrect in the previous, in this chat, which is, it wasn't about repurposing, it was refurbishing. That's why I said it's a controversial one and probably the wrong forum to ask this on. But why aren't we, in the face of job losses and capital flight, refurbishing what we have as we ramp up renewables? And I have to drop off now. So I'll listen to the recording. Thank you.
Okay.
If we get a solid answer, I'll also drop it to you. But as you say, it's a controversial and not a straight and easy answer. And I think, Joanne, that was a question probably more for Steve. But if you would like to express a view, then please feel free.
Okay. So I think that firstly, the first thing to say is we are looking at starting a process that is going to take probably 30 or 40 years. And we are looking at the early stages of that process, and we are looking at what are the wise decisions that we need to make as a country. And we're looking at those decisions in the context of a very severe energy supply crisis that has to be addressed. So part of the solution may well be to, I don't know whether when Catherine talks about refurbishment, I suspect that she's probably talking about extending the life of or repairing some of our coal-fired power stations. And I would agree that this is a priority for the country to be able to, as part of the solution, to be able to get us out of load shedding. But I think there is also the reality that some of those power stations may not be able to have their life extended. And that therefore you are going to look at some level of closure, or they are totally uneconomical to run. Whatever you do to them, the cost of running them is much higher than the cost of or anything that you could get back in terms of the power. So I think that there are those scenarios. National Treasury, as part of the Eskom debt restructuring, is currently engaged in an exercise to assess those particular issues. And I think that the results of that are going to be a very, very important input into this conversation. And certainly NECOM has also done a whole lot of work around that and has prioritized 6 power stations where we need to really focus in order to be able to increase the energy availability factor. And in order, if you get those power stations working at full capacity, you start to make very big differences to the energy availability factor. So taking that into account, there is still a long-term process of a coal phase down, or the phase down of some of that coal fleet. And so when we talk about repurposing and repowering, in fact, we are talking about starting to look at what other ways could you be using that installed infrastructure and that capacity, including the fact that it is right at the grid, in order that you are keeping the level of generation of power, increasing it, and ensuring that you don't just close down that plant and you've got nothing in its place. So I think that when we talk about that repurposing, repowering is looking at a set of different ways to be able to work around that. I think we do have the example of Komati is the pilot that has been put in place in relation to that. But our repurposing and repowering is really about when you can no longer run those coal plants anymore, how do you ensure that the economies that currently exist in those areas and the capacity that is provided to the grid from those areas is provided, but in different ways. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I think you might have said what Thabang wanted to say. I see his hand dropped down. So Steve, I'll hand over to you and I'll give Thabang an opportunity to add if there's anything else that he would like to add. Steve?
Yeah, thanks. I would just maybe add that this needs, any investment in coal needs to be thought of in the context of climate constraints and the NDC. And so any sort of refurbishment needs to happen in that context. And as Joanne said, you know, if you also factor in air quality, a lot of this plant has a fairly fixed lifespan, and there's not that much refurbishment that you can do. But some of it, sure, and any improvement that you can to the coal fleet within those constraints is obviously important. There was one other point that I wanted to make that's just slipped my mind. It'll come back to me.
While you're thinking about that, Thabang, is there anything that you would like to add? I did note your hand.
Yes, thanks, Joanne. Two issues. Maybe the first, let me start with the last point. Yes, there is work that Treasury is doing to do some thorough understanding of how can we resuscitate our existing assets, because repurposing them is not the first option for the benefit of the grid. So the work is being done. We will get a better understanding as soon as the report is made available by Treasury. The department is also part of that because we are concerned about the implications on the security of supply if you repurpose without doing a thorough analysis on the system requirements. So we're waiting for Treasury to conclude that work, and we're going to have engagements with the consultants and Treasury and agree how we take that work forward. The second issue is in relation to my first question, which I asked prior, and maybe it's just me being confused because I went through the first presentation on the electricity part by Steve, and I saw that there are some numbers that are not currently in the IRP 2019, but I had Deepak confirmation that the disaggregation of the electricity allocation insofar as it relates to solar PV, wind, and battery is purely based on IRP and not on the slides that are presented earlier on by Steve. So I take that as a confirmation that we're still working on the same page. We will engage obviously on the electricity recommendations because we believe that there are certain nuances that must be unpacked in a little bit more detail so that we can explain the situation better to our principals. Thanks.
Thank you, Thabang. Steve, can I hand back to you? I don't know if you remembered your point, your hand went up, and also to address Thabang's question. Thanks.
Yeah, so yeah, I remember the point that I wanted to raise. A lot of the latest modeling, both globally and locally in South Africa, are looking at the role of keeping some coal plant on and using them at very low aggregate utilizations. And so that provides a bit of energy security in the system. And if you were faced with a crisis like the EU has been faced with recently, you have this plant in reserve, but also that it can provide a peaking function for interseasonal peaking. And so that's something that is also kind of supportive of the coal refurbishment position. And then I look forward to Thabang's engagement. But yes, the electricity recommendations made by the PCC are separate to those that were used as the basis for the investment plan.
Thanks very much. Deepak, over to you.
Yeah, Steve has addressed the clarity I wanted to provide, but just for emphasis, they are different things. So the PCC recommendations on the electricity plan or the energy mix are very different to the basis for the JET IP. And in this context, let me also clarify that we chose to have these sessions, first information sharing session, and then deeper consultation sessions with stakeholders, including government, precisely because we felt that while they were separate, there were clearly some linkages. But it's important to indicate that the PCC itself was not involved in the formulation of the JET IP. It was a presidential climate finance task team, and that the PCC, in taking a long-range view based on the NDCs and based on our carbonization or decarbonization commitments, is how we are addressing the issue of what we think our proposals might look like in the process of a revision or an amendment of the IRP. So the JET IP is still very much within the current policy framework. The other question with respect to refurbishment versus repurposing, I think refurbishment is in essence also inclusive of running plant better, of maintaining plant better, and managing power station operations better. And in this context, let me say that even the Minister of Finance, in addressing the budget provisions for ESCOM, made it pretty clear that some of the resources need to be used on the ESCOM balance sheet or in the ESCOM income statement with a view to clawing back up to slightly better levels of EAF, energy availability factors, in those plants where that prospect exists. And those plants in large part have been analyzed with a view to looking at where it's feasible. And so, no, absolutely, a process of addressing maintenance backlog, a process of addressing good power station management, a process of addressing process control mechanisms at the level of operations is absolutely key to getting the maximum EAF, given the nameplate capacity of the plants that are currently, on average, across the fleet, performing at less than 60% energy availability factors. The last point I wanted to make is that the 8.5 billion, and I'm going to say this quite explicitly, was premised by the offerers of that finance on this being in order to achieve our decarbonization objectives. Of course, there will still be a debate whether this large amount of resources going towards the grid, which do not have a direct impact on decarbonization, is within that 8.5 billion or not. And we, both from government, PCC, as well as the PCFTT, have been pretty adamant that the grid is there in order to facilitate additional renewable energy coming on stream. And so the real question, which I have not heard anyone raise here, is not the 8.5 billion and what it might or might not be used for, but how do we close this gap of $90 billion between the JET IP's estimate of total cost to 2030 for the investment plan and the fact that we have not even begun to raise those resources, either from the public or the private sectors. And so for me, the real question going forward is, can we begin implementing this plan, but more importantly, beginning to articulate it in a way where public and private commitments, as well as the regulatory and policy frameworks, enable the mobilization and scaling up of the $90 billion that we need to achieve the base for our decarbonization objectives by 2030, as well as over the next 2 to 5 years, the energy security that we require to get rid of or at least dramatically reduce load shedding.
Thanks, Deepak. I think there is some very valuable input there. I don't see any other hands at the moment. But then what we're hearing is that there is there's a number of different pieces of information that we're trying to synthesize and align around. The JET IP, I think, has been seen as a fairly controversial piece, but it is very separate and distinct from the job of the PCC. So the PCC's energy view is separate from what has gone into the JET IP and separate from the IRP. So we really do need to ensure that there is alignment and an understanding of where it's the same and why it's different. And then to really understand over the next 10 years or over the next 5 years, what are those no regret decisions that we need to take in order to ensure that we solve for energy availability, grid stability, and then the decarbonisation foundation, which we need to lay over the short term. And they are very complementary, although they are competing objectives, they are complementary, I think, in the decisions that we need to take. I don't see any other comments or questions. I've been back to the Q&A, and I don't see anything in the chat. Can it really have been that clear? I mean, there is a further discussion which is in person, and maybe that is what is needed, is the in-person discussion that is taking place on the 22nd of March. And I do think that this is an easier conversation to have in person, but this is a conversation that, you know, a thought fuels another thought, and online it sometimes is a bit impersonal, particularly we don't see each other either, you know, frantically nodding our heads or disagreeing. And I think it's those visual cues that will help us to have a far more engaged conversation when we meet on the 22nd. But we do still have time left. We do have some key people around not around the computer, if not around the table. So please do feel free to raise any further questions. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next process if there are no questions, but please do just think about those questions if there is anything else you would like to add. But as I say, we have on the 22nd of March from 9 to 2 o'clock a session at the Southern Sun. It is a hybrid session to accommodate those that can't join in person, but I really do encourage as many of you as possible to join in person, because I do think that there's value in having a conversation on this, and conversations are far, as much as the world has become hybrid and remote, I do think that nothing replaces a physical conversation, especially on such an important topic, and where we do need to ensure that we are aligned in thoughts and next steps. So that session is aimed to ensure that we consult with all the key representatives so that all the views and voices are heard. That will then, together with today's comments, will result in further recommendations being made. We then are going to be building on the consultations in February and March with social partners. And this will then be concluded in a national colloquium on the 29th of March, where we will workshop the findings one last time to ensure that there is alignment on the, what does our Deputy Chair say, consensus opinion on what it is that we are going to be presenting to the President in the second quarter of this year. So we also, as the PCC, will draft the electricity planning recommendations report to the social partners once it has been reviewed by the commissioners. And I see that Simpiwe has added an email address, mitigation@climatecommission.org.za, should you have any further questions that you didn't want to raise today or that comes to you when you're going through the documents later. So if there's no further questions, Simpiwe, have I covered all the governance and requirements of what I need to do today?
Yes, you have. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne.
Thanks so much. So it is a Friday afternoon. We thought that a Friday afternoon was a good time for a fireside conversation. And maybe if we did have a fireside and a glass of wine or a beverage of choice, this conversation would continue until 4. But in the absence of that, I want to thank you all for your time today and give you an hour back in your day. So thank you very much. And thanks very much to Steve and Joanne, the presenters. And thanks for your participation and comments and questions. Thanks. Steve, is there anything you would like to add? I see you've come off mute.
No, I was just going to say thank you to you for ably managing the questions, and to Tsakani for introducing the process. So, and thanks to the audience. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.